So basically in this theme of the workshop, which is human-centric computing, so I have chosen the topic, as you can see, it is cognitive computing. I'm sure some of you have heard the term, while some of you may not have heard the term. Now, the cognitive computing is a vast field. What I am going to concentrate on today is the pros and cons of a mathematical approach to cognitive computing. Now, we all know that whenever we want to model something, in science, we try to model everything mathematically, right? So cognitive computing, as you understand, is related to brain-like computing. And this being a workshop on human-centric computing, I think cognitive computing is a theme very much fitting with the topic of the workshop. Now, when we mean or when we talk about human-like computing, then we need to model the human-like computing on a machine, right? And the best way to model it on a machine is to find the mathematics which we want to model. And I shall be talking on the pros and cons of such a mathematical approach to cognitive computing. Now, when we talk about human-centric computing, the question that will immediately come is, why human? This is because the computing that we do on our computer is basically silicon computing, right? Right now, if you run a program in Python or in C or in MATLAB, what you are using is your silicon hardware, right? So that is a non-living system doing the computing. And when we talk about human computing, it is basically a living system. But is it that we human are alone in computing? Does nature, other animal forms, do not do any computing? Of course not. In fact, it is said that every animal in this nature, if it has a nervous system, it does computing. That means when a tiger jumps on its prey, it has to compute that how far the prey is, how far is my ability to jump, and how much should I run before I make the jump. So, and the deer, which is the prey, is also doing the computing that what distance should I maintain from the tiger in order to escape from getting caught. So, in the same way, when we step on a crowded road, just now I was coming to the office, it was a very crowded road, and there was a heavy traffic. And when I had to cross the road in front of Indian Statistical Institute, I had to make a computation that how far, there is a signal right now, so I don't need much computation. But a few years ago, there was no signal here. So I had to make a computation that how far the bus is and how fast should I walk. And in this way, it is same as the tiger and the deer as the prey. So all living systems do computing. Nervous system is our computing hardware. All of us have a nervous system, which is the computing hardware. And the nervous system consists of a brain and spinal cord, which makes all this computation. But do only animals make computation? And plants are also living organisms. Like they are also living beings. They also have life. Do the plants not make any computation? Of course, some of the great scientists like our great Jagadish Chandra Bose, Sir Jagadish Chandra Bose, he showed that even plants, more than 100 years ago, he showed that even plants make computation, right? For their survival, right? But it is different from the animal-like computation because plants do not have a nervous system. So if you look at this slide of mine, I have posed these questions that whether this nervous system, NS, if you look at the word NS in my slide, particularly in bold, it is written, NS goes to intelligence and intelligence goes to NS, right? So is it, I have given some question mark there. The reason is that people like Jagadish Chandra Bose that showed that even without an NS, that is even without a nervous system, even plants who do not have an NS, they can also do some type of computation. All living beings for their survival need to do computation. So basically in human-centric computation, we are studying this domain of nervous system, artificial intelligence, inspired from the brain, inspired from the nervous system. And all our studies on modern computers, which we call silicon intelligence, as I have told, starts from the study of nervous system. This you may or may not know, but the great journey of computer science has actually started from a study of nervous system. So that is why the topic that we have chosen today is the pros and cons of mathematically modeling cognitive computing is related to this journey of computer science from nervous system. Now let us see how modern computers have emerged from a study of human intelligence, animal intelligence, in fact, all of nervous system, right? So modern computer, as you all know, started from von Neumann's architecture. 1903 to 1957 was his survival period. Von Neumann lived only for 54 years and is considered to be the greatest mathematician of the last century. So von Neumann, he got his architecture of computer from basically Alan Turing. These are great names we all know. I'm coming to Alan Turing, but before I come to Alan Turing, let me utter this, that von Neumann built his architecture based on Alan Turing's work, but even when he was building his architecture, it was called the EDIVAC machine. The EDIVAC machine, which von Neumann had actually built, and all our modern computers, the laptop I'm sitting in front of, the machines you are all sitting in front of, are all basically modeled on von Neumann's work. And at that time, when he was designing this EDIVAC machine, the father of modern computers, he was writing a book, The Computer and the Brain. And when he died in 1957 in hospital, he was still writing this book, The Computer and the Brain. Actually, this was a study. This was a book which was trying to show that how the computer has developed from the study of the brain, from the study of the nervous system. And that is why today's cognitive systems, when we talk about, has actually its origin in John von Neumann, though we all may not be knowing. Now let us see what John von Neumann was writing at that time. He had chosen the nervous system or the human brain as the ideal model for his computer. In this book, his chapters are titled as follows: Function of Neuron. Do all of us know what are neurons? Neurons are the basic cells of the nervous system, right? If you have forgotten your biology classes, becoming engineers, you must not forget, because that is the basic engineering, the basic biological engineering on which modern computers are built. And what is that? Von Neumann was writing. The first chapter was Function of Neuron. The second chapter was Nature of Nerve Impulse. And remember, von Neumann was writing a book on electronics. He was writing a book on circuits, writing a book on computers, right? And his first chapter was Function of Neuron. Second chapter was Nature of Nerve Impulse. His third chapter was Problem of Memory in Nervous System. We all know about the problem of memory in our modern day computers, right? We talk about hard drive, we talk about external drives, we talk about RAM, we talk about ROM, we talk about bottlenecking in memory, right? And von Neumann was studying all that in terms of nervous system, that is our memory, the human memory, right? Then he was talking about the digital and analog parts of the nervous system. Just imagine, in 1957, on his deathbed, basically he knew he was dying in hospital, right? On his deathbed, he was trying to write a digital and analog electronics of the nervous system. That was his next chapter. The next chapter was the logical structure of the nervous system. So virtually it seems he was writing down a digital electronics book, but it was all ending with the word nervous system. And then came the very crucial chapter, the language of the brain. We all know that in order to communicate, we need various languages, right? We need low-level languages, we need high-level languages, we need machine-level languages, we need assembly languages, right? And he was talking about the language of the brain. So that was the first draft. That was the first, that was the first book. That was the book he was trying to write when he died. His wife later published this book after he died, right? Now, when he was in, and not only about this book, when he prepared the EDVAC, which I was talking about, which is the first modern computer, the von Neumann architecture, the basic thing we are all using today, even in that report of EDVAC, he had his only one reference. That entire report contained only one reference. This is von Neumann's picture on the screen. And what was that reference? The reference is a logical calculus of the ideas immanent in nervous activity by McCulloch and Pitts, which was published in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics in the year 1943. So in 1950s, von Neumann was developing the EDVAC. Prior to EDVAC, another machine was developed. It was called the ENIAC, E-N-I-A-C. But ENIAC had a severe memory problem. That means in ENIAC, you cannot change your program. You have to change the entire hardware again to make a new calculation. You run a function, you do the computation, then if you have to run another function, you have to change the hardware. That means you couldn't store a program that you can do today in the memory. EDVAC overcame this problem. How EDVAC overcame this problem of ENIAC? That was related to this paper written by two other scientists, McCulloch and Pitts, who published this paper in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics, and it was again related to nervous activity. So just imagine that the modern electronics was developing, the modern computer architecture was developing entirely based on the nervous system. So it is no wonder that today we have to talk more and more on the cognitive science thing, because computer science, by dissociating itself from this, from its history, has actually getting stuck. Right? So great computer scientists today are again trying to tell us that we have to go back the path of McCulloch and Pitts. We have to retrace the path of von Neumann. We have to retrace the path of Alan Turing, who all studied the nervous system in order to develop computer science, in order to develop modern electronics. These McCulloch and Pitts, I'm talking a little bit more about them. These were again two great scientists. Pitts was a fantastic mathematician. And McCulloch had training in psychology, in cognitive science, as we call it today, and several other aspects. He was also a very good mathematician. Today, you can't imagine a psychologist doing fair amount of mathematics. But in Europe, in other countries, a lot of psychologists do a lot of mathematics, even today. But in our country, there is no such culture. We normally think that psychologist is a humanities subject, and dull people go there and bright people like us go for mathematics. It is not true. The great psychologist McCulloch was actually a great mathematician. And he took the help of another great mathematician, Pitts, to solve the problem of memory of ENIAC so that EDVAC could be built. And you would be thrilled to know, this being an electronics department organized conference, FDP program, you will be thrilled to know that this McCulloch and Pitts at that time published a paper in IRE. What is IRE? Today we call it IEEE. At that time it was called the IRE, Institute of Radio Engineers. At that time that was the name. And in that IRE proceedings, McCulloch and Pitts published a paper which was titled, "What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain." Imagine, in an electronics journal, a paper was published, what the frog's eye, frog means frog, which we see in our neighborhood, in the jungles and bushes, right? Around our house, in the ponds. So these McCulloch and Pitts had experimented on frog and tried to find the currents and voltages going on inside the frog's eye and how those signals, those currents and voltages are sent to the frog's brain. That was the paper. So this was the study going on at that time for the development of modern computer science. And here are pictures of McCulloch and Pitts. On the left, you can see two gentlemen. The younger one is Walter Pitts and the older one is McCulloch, right? These two together wrote all these great works. And on the right, can anyone tell me whose picture is it on the right? It is Norbert Wiener, the great mathematician and the father of cybernetics, the father of communication theory, right? So Norbert Wiener understood the great work that these McCulloch and Pitts were doing. And he took these young Pitts to his laboratory. He worked with young Pitts. And very few people could understand Norbert Wiener's own mathematics. It was such a brilliant mathematics that very few people could understand. And Pitts is writing a letter to McCulloch. Why I am showing this is because we know so little about these people like McCulloch and Pitts, although we do digital electronics every day. But these are actually the father figures of digital electronics, whom even von Neumann referred to, right? So what was this Pitts saying? He said, I now understand at once some 7/8 of what Wiener says. That means Norbert Wiener's 7/8 thing he can understand. Most of the people couldn't understand anything about Norbert Wiener's mathematics. He was such brilliant, such exceptional. Okay, but this Pitts is saying, people say that I can understand 7/8 of it, which I am told is something of an achievement. Pitts wrote in a letter to McCulloch. And he said that to constitute the first adequate discussion of statistical mechanics, so they were trying to model the neuron and the nervous system in terms of statistical mechanics of physics. They said, to understood in this discussion of statistical mechanics understood in the most general possible sense, so that it includes, for example, the problem of deriving psychological or statistical laws of behavior from the microscopic laws of neurophysiology. So from the voltages and currents of neurons, from the microscopic world of neurophysiology, that is neurons, we can try to understand the laws of behavior, the laws of the mind, the laws of cognition, how we think, how we hear, how we perceive. Okay, so this is precisely what McCulloch, Pitts, Wiener were all trying to do together, trying to understand how the brain works, how we think, how our mind works. Okay, so how we behave, right? Can we set up a science for that? That was cybernetics. And that cybernetics, Norbert Wiener is called the father of that cybernetics. And he took the help from these young people who were working to understand the neurophysiology, the basic currents and voltages going on inside the neurons, right? And you all know that when light falls on our eyes, our retina, it converts the optical energy into electrical energy. Retina is basically a transducer. Similarly, when you are hearing me, there are certain cells in your ear which is changing the mechanical vibration to electrical impulse. Right? So entire nervous system is dependent on currents and voltages, right? Of the order of milliamperes and of the order of millivolts and even lower. So basically it was this thing that they were trying to study in order to give birth to electronics. So McCulloch explained to Pitts that he was trying to model the brain with a Leibnizian logical calculus. Calculus here doesn't mean differential and integral calculus. At that time, computation, the word computation was used as a synonym to calculus. Okay, so Leibniz's calculus, they were trying to follow. And remember, what we are trying to talk about in this lecture today, the mathematics of cognitive science, the mathematics of brain science. Okay, so it all started with Leibniz. Leibniz, you know, is the father figure of calculus, of integral and differential calculus, along with Isaac Newton. So McCulloch said that he had been inspired by Principia, in which Russell and Whitehead tried to show that all mathematics can be built from the ground using basic indisputable logic. Actually, based on set theory, a beautiful application of set theory, Russell and Whitehead tried to show that logic, philosophy, can be expressed mathematically. Okay? And McCulloch was inspired by that. Their building block was the proposition, the simplest possible statement, either true or false. So, our binary logic in electronics also follows the same thing, true or false. And McCulloch was getting inspired by Russell's set theory, true or false, right? So in set theory, we all know when we deal with set theory, basically these are the two important things on which set theory also rests. And Russell and Whitehead had developed set theory based to build up logic and to build up philosophy. And McCulloch took inspiration from them. So from there, he employed the fundamental operations of logic, like and, or, all that we need to design gates, right? Logic gates, and, or, not. So they were deriving today all the binary logic gates that we use, all the digital circuits that we use. We owe to McCulloch and Pitts actually, although many of us do not know their name, right? These McCulloch and Pitts actually picked up from Russell Whitehead's set theory of logic and tried to build up these circuits for and, or not, and tried to find those circuits in the human brain. Not only in the human brain, in the frog's brain, in the cat's brain, in the dog's brain. Every living animal, particularly the mammals, particularly the vertebrates, they have this process of transaction through logic gates. And they suggested that we ourselves also have such logic gates. So, and from such gates, complicated networks are built. That is what they're seeing in the third line from the bottom. You can see to link propositions into increasingly complicated networks. Just as we design integrated circuits, right, in electronics, from the basic digital logic circuits. In the same way, complicated networks are generated in the brain from these basic logic gates, and they were trying to find this. From these simple propositions, they derived the full complexity of modern mathematics. So McCulloch was thinking about the neurons. From the neurons comes the neuronal network. From the neuronal network comes the brain, right? Von Neumann's architecture is based entirely on this. So modern computers are based entirely on these logic circuits that was thought about in terms of neurons by McCulloch and Pitts. And what did they show? The basic propositions of McCulloch-Pitts, that neurons are binary system, 0 or 1, our nervous system. That means in our nervous system, a neuron, either those of you who are accustomed to artificial neural network know a little bit about this, that the artificial neural networks with which, ANN, with which we model the biological neurons, they are basically binary systems, right? They have an all or none response. So that was the first principle that McCulloch suggested. Neurons are binary system. Number two, neurons are threshold system. That means they fire only when they cross a threshold. They do not fire if they do not cross the threshold. That is, they are binary when they are above. They give 1 when they are above threshold. They are 0 when they are below threshold. And third, neurons may transmit excitation or inhibition to other neurons. So neurons, they can transmit these excitation or inhibition, that is their response, to another neuron. That is, they can communicate, right? These are the three basic principles on which von Neumann's architecture is also built. And this is the basic picture. All of you who are accustomed to neural networks have already seen this picture. That means inputs are coming, I1, I2, I3, I4, all these inputs are coming to the neurons, right? Neurons carry some weights, and based on these weights, these I1, W1, I2, W2, I3, W3 are all getting summed up in another neuron. That means I1, W1 getting communicated to this second neuron, then to this one. Then I2W2 is communicated to this one, And these neurons antenna, which we call the dendrites, they are picking up all these signals and they are summing up all these signals. If this sum crosses a threshold, then this is transmitted through the neuron's action to the next neuron. And if it doesn't cross the threshold, then it gives a zero response. It is not communicated to the next neuron. It is this basic principle on which the modern von Neumann architecture is built. Okay. Now, another very important mathematical principle which is related to modeling of the brain. This is very important because so far we have been talking only about individual neurons and how individual neuron communicates with another neuron. But in cognition, McCulloch and Pitts were talking about modeling behavior. So not only the neurophysiology, in terms of neurophysiology, that is individual neurons' behavior, they were trying to model the entire thinking mind. So you have to go a step ahead. And here a different mathematics is required. And this mathematics, as I have told you already, McCulloch was inspired by this person, Gottfried Leibniz, who lived in the 17th century. And in the 17th century, Leibniz was the first person to design a successful mechanical calculating machine. So if we talk about the modern day computer, its earliest version was prepared by this Leibniz in the 17th century. It was the first successful mechanical calculating machine. And Leibniz dreamt of building a machine that could manipulate symbols in order to determine truth values of mathematical statements. That means a single neuron, it can also generate truth value, right? If it crosses a threshold, it is 1. If it doesn't cross a threshold, it is 0. That I have told you. But if I tell you that 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, right? This is a mathematical statement. Can a single neuron determine that? Definitely not. Because the single neuron only behaves in terms of its threshold. And this is a mathematical statement whose truth value has to be determined. If 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, whether this is true or whether this is false. So this requires a decidability problem. You have to take a decision. And this decidability problem is what in German language called Entscheidung problem. As you can see here written in blue, Entscheidung problem is basically the decidability problem. That is, the machine has to take a decision whether 2 plus 5 is equal to 7 or not, right? So this Gottfried Leibniz was dreaming of such a machine at that time. And he realized that in order to do that, he would require mathematics. What type of mathematics? He understood that the first step is to create a formal language, right? A language for the machine. And that would consist of a formal system and a set of axioms. And then he said that every such statement, like 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, x plus y whole square is equal to x square plus 2xy plus y square, every such statement in the formal system should be consistent with the axioms and should not contradict each other. That means if you can determine that 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, then you should also be able to determine that 9 plus 3 is not equal to 11, right? In case of 9 plus 3, you have to say false. In case of 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, you have to say true, right? So there should be a consistency. So you should form such a set of axioms and such a formal system and such a language where all such mathematical statements can be dealt with and you can take a decision. Today's computer can do to a large extent all these things, right? So at that time, Leibniz was trying to work on this decidability problem, okay? So is it possible, in another word, is it possible to develop an algorithm which can decide whether a given statement is derivable from the basic axioms? That means from the basic axioms, can we conclude that 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, this is true, and 3 plus 9 is equal to 11, this is false? This is the decidability problem or the Enshenjung problem. The two pictures that you can see above are Bertrand Russell and Whitehead, the two great logicians, the two great philosophers who built up logic and philosophy on mathematics. And this is their famous 3-volume Principia book, Principia Mathematica. Okay, the next picture is David Hilbert, another fantastic mathematician who posed 3 questions to this Leibniz problem. Leibniz was trying to build a machine, and the machine would follow an algorithm. And what is that algorithm? To decide whether a given statement is derivable from the set of axioms. Hilbert generalized this question further. He said that we have to consider 3 questions. We have to build a mathematics. Leibniz said we need a mathematics, right? Hilbert raised the question that we want to do it with mathematics, but is mathematics complete? That means we want to depend on the language of mathematics, but is that language, mathematics itself, a complete language? Question number 1. Question number 2, Leibniz talked about consistency. Everything should follow consistently from the axioms. He said, is this language of mathematics consistent? So question number 1, is it complete? Question number 2, is it consistent? And third was this decidability problem. Can it take the decision through mathematics, right? Kurt Gödel proved in 1930s that the first 2 questions are negative. That means mathematics is not complete. Neither is mathematics consistent. Kurt Gödel, the great logician, broke the first 2 edifices of Hilbert. Okay, so you can't have a mathematics to do all these which is consistent and which is complete. Then when we do a mathematics with which we can develop such an algorithm as stated here, which can decide, no, you can't find even that mathematics which can solve the decidability problem. So neither is mathematics consistent, nor is mathematics complete. Kurt Gödel proved that. Neither is mathematics okay for decidability. Okay, who proved that? Teacher and a student. The teacher's name, the third answer to Hilbert's problem, came out negative. This teacher, his name was Alonzo Church. In 1930s, after Kurt Gödel proved that the first 2 questions of Hilbert are negative, Alonzo Church proved that the third question of decidability through mathematics is also negative. And his student, the great Alan Turing, the founder of modern computer with the help of von Neumann, Alan Turing also proved that mathematics is not the language for decidability. You can't decide through mathematics. Then all these Russell, Whitehead had developed a fantastic logic of mathematics, a fantastic set theoretic mathematics, and now all these 4 people, they have proved, 3 people I mean, Church, Turing, and Kurt Gödel, they have proved that however fantastic mathematics may look, that mathematics is not sufficient, is not equipped enough to handle these 3 questions of Hilbert: completeness, consistency, and decidability. All these are negative for mathematics. So how much powerful you consider yourself as mathematicians, I don't know, but the great mathematicians have proved this. Okay, so then what happened? Did everything stop there? No, everything didn't stop there. Turing developed his Turing machine. Church developed a different mechanism called lambda calculus. Modern computers didn't borrow so much from Church, it borrowed more from Turing, and it developed these modern computers through von Neumann, right? So what we are talking about was how mathematics can be used to model the mind. Our title was the pros and cons of mathematics in understanding cognitive computation, right? And we have studied already that mathematics, the process, that mathematics is not strong enough to handle the decidability problem which we need to impart to a machine. We want to build, our dream is to build a machine. McCulloch's dream it was, Pitt's dream it was, von Neumann's dream it was, to build a machine which can take the decision, right? Just as we human beings take a decision. But we find that mathematics doesn't have all the properties to make the machine take such a decision. Then what to do? So let us recapitulate. Leibniz had set the following tasks for mathematicians. 1, create a universal language in which all possible problems can be stated, whether it is 2 plus 5 is equal to 7, this problem, or whether it is x plus symbolic problem, x plus y whole square is equal to x square plus 2xy plus y square, or whether it is some other logical problem like two men sitting on two sides of the road. You ask a question to one man, which way to go. The man is does not tell the truth always. This type of puzzles we all know about, right? Whether it is a arithmetic problem, whether it's an algebraic problem, whether it is some logical problem. Our dream is to build a machine which would have a universal language in which all possible problems can be stated, and 2, the machine can take a decision to solve all such problems stated in that universal language. But now that dream seems to be on the verge of getting crushed. Russell thought that problem 1 can be solved by set theory. And the problem 2, for the problem 2, one only has to define a notion of computability. But Gödel, Church, and Turing made us realize that it is not such an easy thing to do. There are several limitations in the machine. But still, mathematics has something in it through which some modeling can be done if we follow nature. If we follow what is going on in nature, what is going on in the nervous system. That path was shown by Turing and von Neumann. That path was shown by McCulloch and Pitts. That means simply through mathematics, you can't develop such a machine. If you really want to develop such a machine, then you have to study what is going on in nature, what is going on in the nervous system, and then try to apply your mathematics into that natural world and to try to develop your computational machines. Then to some extent, you will be able to mimic the neurons, the nerves, the nervous system, the mind. So what I'm trying to tell you in the first half of this lecture is that mere mathematics cannot give birth to such an algorithm which can take decision. In order to do that, you have to study nature, you have to study the nervous system, how animals take the decision, how living beings take the decision, and only then you can apply your mathematics to partly solve this decidability problem. And that was precisely what they did. And this was the paper of Alan Turing, which became such famous. Initially, it was not famous. Von Neumann didn't notice it. It was Russell who made it famous. Russell said, whatever I have said is wrong. I thought everything could be done through this logical set theory and mathematics. But Turing has shown that without studying the brain, this logical set theory is nothing. And he made Turing famous. Nobody knew Turing before Russell. Okay, and what was the paper? On computable numbers with an application to Enshenzhung problem, which was published in the Proceedings of London Mathematical Society in 1936. And the major guiding principle in Turing's paper is to understand the nature of functioning of brain while computing a number. How the brain computes a number. If we realize that, we'll be able to build the machine. And that was the Turing machine. So what Turing thought is human beings have discrete states of mind, and hence Turing assumed discrete states of the machine. Modern terminology configuration, we use this word state. Instead of using the states of mind, we use the states of machine, right? Automata theory, those who are coming from this background, we all know about this. So implicitly, Turing assumed his machine to be a finite state machine. And all these would not have been done had Turing not studied the human brain. Now we have come to the end of the first part of our lecture. where we have shown you that the process of mathematics in modeling the mind, the process that you can apply mathematics to model the mind, but only if you study the mind, only if you study the brain. By simple mathematics, you can't do that. Okay, that is the pros. Now we are trying to get into the cons. And what is cons? This workshop is about the human-centric computation. And from human-centric computation, we understood that in order to do human-centric computation, we need to know how humans compute. And not only human, how all living beings compute. That is the first part of the talk. We have understood this from this first part. From Turing to the promise of Pitts. And what was the promise of Pitts? That from basic neurophysiology, from basic logical circuits, I have to understand the brain as a whole. That means in order to know the brain as a thinking machine, I have to start from the basic logical circuits. Yes or all or none response, the all or none firing in the neurons. But from there, I shall begin to understand how senses are perceived, how we understand what is sensation, how we understand that something is hot and something is cold. If I give you a cup of coffee now, right? If I'm served cold, my brain immediately realizes it is cold. How it understands sensation? Perception. What is perception? The way you understand that the sensation, perception, etc. are written in black, whereas the HCC goes to human computing is written in red. Turing to the promise of Pitts is written in blue. This is perception. Your perception of color. This is one perception. There are several other perceptions. Cognition. Cognition is something more. That you are now understanding or not understanding my lecture. You may feel sleepy, right? Because I'm going very fast, talking about a lot of things. You may not feel very interested. So you are not cognizing. Whereas one or two of you may be feeling interested. Oh, this is something new and this is something interesting. I need to know this. So he's cognizing. This is cognition, right? And there is intelligence. Through all these sensation, that is our ability to understand hot and cold, right? Perception, that is our ability to perceive several things like color, brightness, darkness, loud, that I'm shouting very loudly, so that is loud, right? So, and cognition, that I'm understanding things, our intelligence develops. And if we want to do cognitive computing, we need to apply all this, right? When we talk about artificial intelligence, we actually try to model this intelligence, right? So these are the basic things in human computing which we want to model through mathematics. Now, question is how to do that? The limitations of mathematics have already been shown. And we have understood that by studying the nature, by studying the brain, by studying the computation, to some extent we can use mathematics. But that was in 1940s and 1950s we are talking about. Then modern computers evolved, right? Then AI also evolved. What is the state of the art now? That is the question. Are we trying to understand sensation? Are we really understanding perception? What do we feel about intelligence now? Is our AI really equipped to handle the biological intelligence? What should be the approach? Now, there are several approaches which are state of the art. I shall be talking about mostly one such approach in the last part of my talk. That means in the next 30 minutes, I shall be covering that part. But before I get into that part, I need to define what is cognition. Because I have told we are trying to understand cognitive computing. The starting point, McCulloch-Pitts, Turing, von Neumann, we have all understood. What is the present point? In order to know what is the present point, we have to understand what is cognition. And what is cognition? It is written beautifully in this book. It's a book on cognitive psychology which states every science has two components. Its subject matter and the descriptive theory that explains it. Beginning with the control of action, the content of the study of human cognition has been explored. It's a very important word. Cognition has something to do with control of action. If I want to drink water, if I want to pick up this bottle, I require cognition. I need to locate this bottle. I need to locate its cap. I need to open the cap. And I need to drink, right? All this action requires cognition. If there were no action, there wouldn't have been any cognition. So living beings on this world, in order to survive, they have to perform action. And in order to perform action, they require cognition. So cognition has something very intimately related to action. Cognition requires processing of information, and human cognitive system may also be called the human information processing system. Information requires a code, content, and one more operation that change the content, and a medium to represent the code. What does this mean? A very fine example is given here. The code representing binary numbers is ones and zeros. What is the content? The content is a particular number, right? To be represented. And what are the operations? Operations are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. What is the medium? The medium may be a paper. The medium may be chalk on a blackboard. The medium may be ink on the paper. The medium may be electric charges in a computer. The medium may be electric charges in my brain. So, cognitive system, when we talk about cognition or when we talk about information processing, it need not be always currents and voltages. Even when I write something with pen and paper, at that time also I am doing information processing. I am writing a code and I am representing that code, right? In the same way, in human cognitive system, the medium is the neurons and the pathways of the brain. And the content is the representation of the world and the individual's action in it. Cognitive psychology describes the code used to represent the world, the operations that encode a representation of the world from sensory input, right? And the operations that direct a person's actions. So basically cognition, what you have learned, cognition has something to deal with action. Cognition has something to do with control of that action. And for controlling that action, we require information processing. And for information processing, we require a code. And for a code, we require a medium to represent the code. So all these are related to cognition. So if we need to build a machine, for the machine also, we require each and everything of this, right? But all actions are not voluntary actions. There are several actions which are involuntary actions, like the picture shown here, a reflex arc. See, I am taking up my cup of tea. If it is too hot, I bring it close to my lip, I understand it is very hot, I immediately remove it. This is involuntary. There is no cognition behind it. Like here, if there is a candle burning, and if you suddenly unmindfully put your finger into that candle, your hand immediately feels the heat and you remove the hand. This is involuntary action. This does not require the brain. Only the spinal cord of the nervous system is enough to control this involuntary action. It is called a reflex arc. We today are talking about cognition. So we are not talking about such involuntary actions, though this is also a very important thing to study. But in today's class, we are not talking about this involuntary action. We are talking about voluntary control of muscles. That means this is, I want to drink a cup of tea. I'm picking up the cup of tea. I'm sipping the cup of tea. This is all voluntary action. There's nothing involuntary like what you see here on the slide, right? And voluntary control requires the brain. Cognition requires the brain and it requires the modules of the brain. What are the modules? So two things must be clear. we have cognition is related to action, but we are talking only about voluntary action. When we think and decide and do, right? And this requires activity of the brain. And the brain has certain modules to perform this activity. Basically, 4 important lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. Occipital is at the back, the frontal is the front, the temporal are those on the 2 sides of our ears, and the parietal is at the top. Okay, so these are the basic regions of the brain which are doing the computation. Okay, now it is written here, you can find that a voluntary action is entirely different from a reflex. An animal is born with a fixed set of reflexes that perform an unchanging set of actions. In contrast, an animal is not born with the ability to perform any particular voluntary action. It is here that the animal has to learn and perform, use its memory to store the learning and perform. Right? So it is not involuntary action is something inborn, but voluntary action or cognition is not something inborn. You have to get yourself learned through experiences. Okay? Now, we have already stated that to understand the brain or to understand the nervous system, mathematics is insufficient. Mere mathematics is insufficient. Right? Now we are talking about, then how do we proceed? How do we proceed to understand the brain? Today's science has given us a very powerful mathematics to do certain such study. Although Russell's set theory, it was thought is all powerful, and people tried to build up the edifice of mathematics from Russell's set theory, but Hilbert's questions and their answers proved that it is not enough. So people searched for new tools in mathematics to get into the brain. And one such powerful tool in mathematics is the graph theory, the new mathematics of brain science. This graph theory, or in the language of physics, in the language of mathematics, it is called graph theory. In the language of physics or statistical mechanics, it is called the complex network theory. And in the language of neuroscience, it is called the brain network or connectomics theory. I'm not sure whether how many of you are accustomed to these words, connectomics. It's a very important word in today's brain science and computer science interface. So if you really want to study brain science today, being a computer scientist, you have to understand this mathematics. Again, I repeat, mathematicians and computer scientists often call them graph theory. Physicists often call them complex network theory. Neuroscientists generally call them brain networks or connectomics. But it is all the same thing to study the brain, right? Although with graph theory, you can study other networks also. Through complex network theory, you can study not only the brain network, you can study a social network. You can study a Facebook network. You can study a Twitter network, right? You can study an Amazon network, right? Who are making the purchases and who are connected to whom, right, in a social network. So through graph theory or complex network theory, you can do all these. But if you really want to study the brain networks, then you apply this graph theory and complex network theory to the study of the brain. So brain networks or connectomics is a particular instance of application of graph theory to understand complex networks. So what is the basics? The basics for modeling the brain as graphs is you have to consider the brain as a network. And any network can be modeled as a graph of nodes connected by edges. The nodes represent some fundamental processing units, and the edges represent the interaction between the nodes. So this is true not only for the brain network. Again, I repeat, this is true even for a social network. This node may be you. This node may be a friend of yours. This node in a social network may be a friend of this person, right? So this person is a common friend of this, and this. This person is acting like a hub of these people. But this person is not connected to this person. Okay? So there is no edge between these two persons. They are not friends. But there is edge between these two, these two, these two, these two. And in particular, this node has a degree 3. Okay? We call that this node has a degree 3. It is sharing edges with 3 other nodes, whereas this node has a degree 2. It is sharing its edges with 2 other nodes. This node has a degree 1. This node also has a degree 1. And so is this node. So it is through this mathematics of nodes and edges that people are now trying to understand not only a complex social network, but also a brain network. Now, you may tell me that, sir, this was already done in artificial neural network, where there were nodes and there were connections. Yes. If you see this bottom picture, these artificial neural networks, which was inspired by McCulloch and Pitts. See this threshold system we talked about, below a threshold, no firing, above a threshold, there is firing. So this node, this picture I already showed you earlier, it is getting inputs from here and here, summing up. If the summing up is crossing the threshold, it is transmitting this signal to here. It is transmitting its signal to here. Again, this signal, if it is crossing a threshold, it is passing it to here. So this is artificial neural net. And these artificial neural nets have already been used by several pattern recognition, machine learning community to do a lot of things, right? So one such artificial neural network is used in machine learning, say for example, the perceptron model or the Hopfield net or the multi-layer perceptron. These people already use. So this network concept was nothing new to them. Even in deep learning, this DL that I have written here is deep learning. There also we are using the convolutional neural networks, the recurrent neural networks, which again are artificial neural nets, which are again following the same logic of nodes and edges. So here also you see nodes and edges. But then what is the difference between these 60s and 70s ANNs and the present day graph theory application to BN, that is brain network? This is in the generalization. This difference is in the generalization. What does that mean? It means that here in the earlier ANN, nodes always represented neurons and nothing else. Only a single neuron represents a node. A single neuron getting its input, passing on to its output, passing on its output. But in the modern biological brain networks, these nodes may not be a single neuron. These nodes may be in various scales. It may be in a fine scale, like a neuron. It may be in a larger scale called mesoscale, called a network. That means all these neurons together may form a single node. Or it may be in a very large scale where individual regions of the brain form a node. How many nodes, how many neurons are there in our nervous system? Almost 10 to the power 14. So if you consider a single neuron, the number of nodes will be 10 to the power 14. And then imagine the number of edges. If there are 10 to the power 14 nodes, then how many edges? A lot more than that. So how do you compute? It's almost impossible to compute. It's almost impossible to do any mathematics with that. So modern day brain science is trying to do generalization. That means instead of taking each individual neuron as it was taken in artificial neural network, and that is the limitation of artificial neural network, let us take a collection of neurons together and let that be considered as one node. That is the mesoscale. Or let us take an even larger collection of neurons, which we call the brain modules, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, or slightly lesser than that, and then connect all those nodes through such edges. Then you can study. So then from 10 to the power 14, you may come down to 10 to the power 5 or 10 to the power 6, and then, or 10 to the power 7, and then you can do much more meaningful computations, or maybe even less. Maybe in the order of 10 to the power 2 or 10 to the power 3, you can do even better computation towards understanding the brain, right? So the question of spatial scale is there in the modern brain networks. And so there is the nanoscale, which considers these neurons only as individual nodes. There is the microscale, which considers a collection of neurons from nanometer to micrometer as the node. There is the mesoscale from micrometer to millimeter, which considers some parts of the brain as nodes, right? For example, the memory system, the limbic system. You may not be accustomed to this term, so I'm not using much jargon. It is larger. In one word, it is larger than neuronal networks. It gives rise to certain systems of the brain. Limbic system is one such system. Or it may be a macro scale, millimeter to centimeter, which are different modules of the brain. Okay, millimeter to centimeter. So these can also be the nodes. So the nodes in graph theory can be this much tiny and huge number to this much large and much smaller number. I think I'm able to communicate what I was trying to tell you. Now, how do you do this graph theory? Okay. So basically, what is written here? Matrices and graphs are formally equivalent. What are matrices? Suppose you have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nodes. Suppose you have been able to divide the brain here into 6 nodes. This is one node, this is one node, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now these 6 nodes, so there is a adjacency matrix, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now you are trying to study whether 1 is connected to 3, 1 is connected to 4, 1 is connected to 5. If there is a connection, you make it 1. If there is no connection, you make it 0. So here the graphs are binary and the graphs are undirected. On the other hand, there can be graphs which are both binary as well as directed. That means 1 is connected to 3 and 3 is also connected to 1. In the previous case, 1 connected to 3 and 3 connected to 1 carry the same meaning. So it's an undirected one, whether it is connected or not, right? That is why you see this symmetry. But here is no such symmetry as in this case, because 1 connected to 3 and 3 connected to 1 may be there. On the other hand, 1 connected to 4, but 4 is not connected to 1. So there is no such symmetry here. So graph can be binary undirected, graph can be binary directed. Graph can be weighted and undirected. That means instead of just making connections in terms of ones and zeros, you now try to calculate how strong is the connection. If it is a strong connection, you give a weight 20. If it is a weaker connection, you give a weight 15. If it is a very weak connection, you give a weight 2. If there is no connection, then as usual 0. Again, it can be binary. Again, it can be undirected weighted. It can be directed weighted. Now the question is, how do you determine the weights? There is connection as well as there is a strength of connection. How do you determine whether one region of the brain is connected to the other region or not? Because if you can find a connection, you can form a matrix. And if you can form a matrix, you can form a graph. I think I've been able to communicate up to this. Okay? So, the two fundamental principles on which brain networks are built, connectomics is built, is segregation. That is, one node is separate from another node. At the same time, integration. That one node may be connected to another node. So based on this principle, we now try to we now just try to see in what modalities people determine whether a node is connected in brain to another node or not. In the past decade, developments in graph theory have provided many new methods for topologically analyzing complex networks. What are these? One is functional MRI. The detection of changes in regional brain activity through their effects on blood flow. It is called the Bold signal, okay? Blood oxygen level. So through imaging, you know that if one region is related to another region. So this is one modality by which you can find connection or strength of connection. Electroencephalography or EEG. You put electrodes on the surface of the brain, right? And the electric field, because of the electric activity going on inside the brain, it generates an electric field on our surface. And by connecting electrodes to that surface in a non-invasive way, you can find which region of the brain is active for which work. And again, you can find which node of the brain is connected to which node or not connected to which node. So these are the modalities, the electrophysiological recording or the imaging modalities by which you can find such nodes connectivity. Now, nodes may be structurally connected. Since there is not much time, I will not go into the details. Structurally connected means you can see through imaging that a node is connected to another node. And functional connectivity is the brain is at work. And in that work, one region is connected to another region. So there are different types of connectivity. We are talking about structural and functional. Right now, only two of these. Okay. So what does this mean? Mapping functional connectivity with fMRI? It means, see this picture. Suppose your brain is at rest. You are just closing your eyes and you are listening to nothing. And in the room, there is no sound. Almost in a soundless room, you are closing in your eyes. At that time, there is no input into your ear. There is no input into your eyes. So your brain is at rest, assumed to be at rest. Then there is a signal in the brain which is recorded. Okay. Now you are given a task. Say slow music is being run on a tape recorder and you are listening to the music, right? And now there is a certain signal in your brain. Okay. So basically at rest, there is a signal. With some task, there is another signal. And now you try to make statistical dependence of different such signals. So in node 1, there is one signal. In node 2, so suppose you have 5 nodes in your brain, okay, or 10 nodes in your brain. I have already told you about the adjacency matrix. So you have to know whether one node is connected to another node or not. So you find at rest, you calculate all these signals. In a task, you again calculate all these signals. You again capture all these signals. Now you try to use statistical correlation, partial correlation, mutual information, which we often do in machine learning also, right? And try to find which nodes are connected to which node. Activity in which node also generates activity in another node, whereas other node is not getting activated. In this way, you can actually quantify connections, okay? And that is precisely what is done. So from data, you can in this way move to you can first go to this adjacency matrix, connection matrix, and from adjacency matrix, you can move to a brain graph. These are some of the references I'm showing you. very recent works, all coming up in 2013, 2014, 2015, and even 2019 and 20. For example, this is a very important paper in 2015, which came up in Nature Reviews of Neuroscience. This how to form these brain graphs. Okay, so basically, the healthy structural functional brain networks that arise during development under genetic control are correlated with cognitive function. So it's the same thing. I'm not repeating. Basically, this is your brain. You can capture some static images of the brain through CT scan and other techniques, and you can form a structural network. Okay, which are the connected regions? Where are the gray cells? Where are the white cells? Where is the cerebrospinal fluid? And you can make a structural connection. On the other hand, you can, as I have shown you, make the brain do some task, relate it to the brain at rest, and try to find the time series data for that task, relate it, and get a functional correlation. So there can be a structural graph, there can be a functional graph. And then you have to do graph theoretic analysis. What is graph? So from the nodes, you go to building the graph, and from the graph, you do this connectivity analysis. What does this mean? There are several types of network analysis techniques available. Even before brain networks came up, people who are doing social networks, a lot of work on social networks, they have designed many techniques to analyze a complex network. Okay? Like they have said that complex networks, hello, can I get 2-3 more minutes? Hello, Dr. Jyoti Prakash?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I'm trying to cover it up in 2-3 or at best 4 minutes. Okay, so what are the complex network analysis after you have formed the graph? How do you analyze this? These complex networks have some very important properties. One property is called the small world network. What is that? The networks are characterized by a combination of high clustering and short path lengths. That means if you move from one node to another node, you don't have to traverse a lot of nodes. Through a very short connection, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, you will reach what apparently seems to be a distant node. So they have these are called small world property. Okay, that is short distances between 2 nodes. You don't have to jump many nodes to get connected to another node. Then there is another property called the scale freeness of the networks, which means that networks, I have already talked about degree, right? How many edges a node is connected to a node has, that is its degree. It is found that there are lots of low degree nodes and there are very few high degree nodes. And when a new node comes in, it has a preferential attachment towards the high degree nodes. This is called the scale freeness of the networks. In other, it has a mathematical significance. This k is inversely proportional to k, etc., which I am not showing here, the mathematical formulation. It is easy to show you. But what is the basic thing? The basic thing is that it is not a random network. It has a preferential attachment. That means it already, when a network develops, it generates a preferential attachment. That is its scale freeness. It has a heavy, long tail. Okay. Then there are measures called degree distributions, which I have already told you. What is the degree and how do you see the degree distribution? It is found that in a log-log scale, the degree distribution follows a straight line. Okay. That means if you plot a node to its degree, that a node has, suppose a node has a very high degree, then another node has a lower degree, then another node has an even lower degree. If you plot this in a log-log scale, it will follow a straight line. This is related to its scale freeness, this degree distribution. Similarly, another very important measure of networks is called the centrality. It is the importance of a node in a network. I showed you in an example that one particular node is connected to 3. It is acting like a hub. So that is like a centrality. Okay, so centrality measure, degree distribution measure, community structure, these are very important analytical tools in complex networks. So you use this for the brain networks. So basically, these great works, see this Barabasi work, the Watson-Strogat's work, and later this Newman work, all these works have actually shown several important mathematical properties of real-world networks. One, we have talked about the scale freeness. We have talked about the modularity, right? We have talked about the community structure. You see, some of the networks are forming communities. They are tightly connected inside the community. They are sparsely connected outside of the community. All these nodes are tightly connected, but sparsely connected to this community. Again, this community is tightly connected within itself, less connected to this. So in this way, you can find important modules in the brain. Which module is active for which work? Which module, which community is connected to which community in the brain? Which is the important hub in the brain, which is acting as a hub for several other communities, several other nodes. Okay, all these are very important studies. These are mathematical properties through which people study the brain. Okay, so the goal of connectomics in the light of network science is therefore to sum up. I'm summing up in this slide. So there are certain number of nodes. I have broken my brain into, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 important nodes, 16 important regions with different colors, okay, with different color codes. And these 16 regions, some of which are connected, some of which are not, we have formed the adjacency matrix. And from the adjacency matrix, we have formed a graph for these 16 regions. And then we can apply our network analysis, which I have told you, the community structure, the small world property, the hub structure, all these to analyze this network and try to come to conclusion about the functionality of the brain. The question may arise that which graph is the best representation of the brain? Is it the binary? Is it the weighted? Is it the directed? Is it that these nodes are all homogeneous as in here? Or is it that the nodes itself should be heterogeneous? That means nodes also have some heterogeneous property. They are not alike. Is it that the edges should be all homogeneous, or the edges should also be of some heterogeneity? This is one type of edge. This is another type of edge. This is another type of edge. It is found that yes, the brain indeed is a hybrid of all these. It is weighted, there is heterogeneity, there is direction, everything has to be included in order to study the brain. So this gives rise to a very rich variety of mathematics, which you have to apply in order to understand the brain network. Okay, so this is the same thing. You see that the networks are, this word is very important, from milliseconds to years. So you see that what the scale that we are talking about is from milliseconds. When one neuron gets connected to another neuron, that journey takes place in milliseconds, right? Which I have already told you. Millivolts are transmitted from one neuron to another neuron. That takes place very fast in milliseconds. But what are the things which works in years? Suppose I have a stroke. I have undergone a stroke. Now, every moment my brain will not change. Some of the regions of the brain will change over months, right? And you have to study those regions. What is the change over months? So if I'm improving, if I'm having rehabilitation, that region may gain its original nature. If I am deteriorating, that region may lose its original nature. So it takes place, such changes, such connections are not millisecond order. Those are months and years order. Okay, so different types of, that is why we are saying that there is so much heterogeneity in the brain. Different scales of time, different scales of space, different natures of nodes, different natures of edges. Okay, since I am almost lot of overtime. I'm completing this. So this concluding slide, the mathematics, it was thought it would be a powerful tool for cognition. But Hilbert, Church, Turing, von Neumann, McCulloch, Pitts, they all showed that it is too distant a dream that mathematics can be directly applied to cognition. But now we have understood that mathematics can be applied to benefit our understanding of the brain, at least for neurological situations, at least for medical situations, at least for clinical situations. This is a nearer possibility. This may be a distant possibility, trying to apply mathematics to understand the entire thinking of the brain. But trying to apply graph theory to understand different modules of the brain and their neurological problems, their problems with aging, their problems with stroke, their problems with different diseases, disorders, is not such a distant dream. It is a much nearer possibility. So that is why I chose this topic for this human-centric computation, because using this brain-like computation, you can actually try to solve neurological disorders. You can try to understand neurological disorders. You may not fully understand cognition today, that may be many years later, but at least how the networks are changing, which nodes are going away, which nodes are joining in, which age is going away, which age is joining in. You can study through imaging modalities and other modalities. So we have written, the improved understanding of the brain network organization has made it possible to address network changes in neurological and psychiatric diseases like stroke, dementia, epilepsy, schizophrenia. How the nodes are changing, how the dynamics of the network are changing. In particular, in several typically global brain disorders, such as Alzheimer's disease, these network studies have shown that the pathology is in fact not equally distributed over the brain. It is not a random distribution, but preferentially affects the hub areas. That means if there is an Alzheimer's disease, there's a hub area from where it is generated. So through brain network mathematics, so here mathematics is becoming handy. It is not that all hope on mathematics is lost. Mathematics is helping us through complex network analysis, through hub property, through small world property, through degree distribution property, through community structure property. It is helping us to understand Alzheimer's disease, understand epilepsy, understand dementia, understand brain aging, and other problems. A new field of computational neurology has thus arrived, which has the potential to provide a rational approach towards the development of new diagnostic and therapeutic strategies for brain disease. So yes, mathematics can be related to cognition, not directly. So the pros was mathematics it is almost impossible to relate mathematics to cognition. The cons of my lecture is that yes, mathematics can be related to cognition, not directly, but the cognitive machine and its problems, the brain, can be understood better through mathematical tools like graph theory. Thank you, and thank you for your cognition of this lecture.
Sir, I have a question, if you allow me to ask.
Sure, lectures are given to hear and try to answer questions if I know your answer. Yeah.
Thank you,
Can
sir.
you please tell me who is giving this question?
Yeah, I'm Dinkaj Goyal from Indraprasth University, Delhi.
Yeah, please.
My question is, sir, what could be the implication of successfully detecting a community in the brain network? Because the community detection itself is considered to be computationally intractable. So somehow, if we are able to detect a community, how would it make sense for the brain networks?
A very good question, Rinkaj. This is because you must be working a little bit or more with community detection techniques. You must be knowing that if we run the different so-called community detection techniques on a complex network, there is a randomness associated with it, right?
True.
if you, for example, InfoMap or any such community detection technique, if you run it over and over again, it is not always that you get the same communities, right? Even in a complex evolving network, forget about the brain network, right? That's why people sometimes try to determine that which are the constant communities, right? Which don't change so much through randomness. Am I correct?
But sir, how will this make sense for the brain network? I mean,
No,
this
first, I'm trying to understand what you have said, right? I'm
true.
first trying to frame your question. Okay. Only if we can frame the question, we can search the answer. What I'm trying to tell you is that your question is related to community detection.
True, sir.
Community detection itself is a difficult problem because community detection is associated with a randomness, right? You assign a particular node to a community, and in another run of the community detection technique, the same node is assigned to another community. Does this happen or does this not?
Yes, it happens, and moreover, we can have the case of overlapped communities also. Quite possible.
Right. We can even have the case of overlapped communities, right?
True.
So these are the difficult problems even in social network. Forget about brain network, right?
Very true.
Very
And
true.
that is why I mean, people have in the literature, people have used bio-inspired techniques because the problem itself is computationally intractable.
Right. So here we are trying to understand the brain as a cognitive machine or the brain as a center of. That is why I told Ringkaj that it is almost impossible at this present state of the art situation to understand how these communities are related to our emotion, how these communities are related to our thoughts, how these communities are related to our action. That is almost an impossibility at this state of the art. Okay.
That is what my question is.
Yeah, that is why this lecture tried to show that these communities' relation to neurological disorders. For example, when you are detecting Alzheimer's disease, people already found that there are certain regions in the brain. If you can model the brain as a network, then you can detect certain hubs, okay, which is typically responsible for the Alzheimer's disease. That means if you can trace the hub, which is the source for the Alzheimer's disease, then you give the doctor some important information that this particular region of the brain is actually leading to this Alzheimer's disease of your patient. Then the doctor can do certain, that is, then it becomes the study of the medical science to do how to go to that deeper region of the brain and how to access that brain, whether it is through medicine, whether it is through surgery, or whether it is through a combination of those two, that I have to reach that hub. Okay. So what I am trying to tell, that talking about emotion, thinking, action, we are far away. But talking about neurological disorders, at least, we are trying to get some confidence that this network structure can give us some clues to diagnostic methodology. That is the only starting point. Okay.
Maybe the structural properties of a complex networks might have been analyzed in detail in comparison to their cognitive implications.
Exactly.
Like one particular node is more profound or more centric to the other node. In that sense. Thank you for this answer, sir. I have one more question. The history of compatibility has always been so very fascinating. How would you compare the contribution of Newman and Turing in so-called in giving the notion of compatibility per se?
Okay, I didn't touch upon this. Maybe in another lecture, I would like to touch upon this. Actually, you see, the finite state machine and the ideas that Turing actually developed related to what is known as today a bottom-up approach. Okay. Whereas Turing's teacher, Alonzo Church, who actually working on that decidability problem and whether you can decide through computation a statement, mathematical statement's truth value, he actually took a different route. He didn't he took a top-down approach. Okay, so when you take a bottom-up approach, you are concerned about the process, right? And you have a sequence of process which you have to perform one after another, and the sequence is very important. This process highly computationally intensive, right? Whereas Church, his teacher, envisaged a process which he called lambda calculus, where he was trying to think about a top-down process where you are not concerned about the sequence of actions. You are concerned only about the function you are about to calculate. I would suggest you to read a little bit on lambda calculus that Alonzo Church studied, because Alonzo Church said that human brain actually computes not in this bottom-up methodology, but in a top-down methodology. Maybe Church was also not fully correct. Maybe Turing had something important associated with his ideas also. Today, what people think that if you take all the computational bottlenecks that are arising today, right, that we are reaching a saturation level of computation, right? All is coming because of this bottom-up approach. Because if you are going through a bottom-up approach, at some point of time, your computability is going to reach a saturation, right? Church tried to give an alternative way that instead of doing this bottom-up approach, you approach it in a top-down process through what he developed called the lambda calculus. But at that time, lambda, not even today, lambda calculus has been made very concrete, and very little study or research has been done on that. That is non-von Neumann architecture. Von Neumann took his architecture entirely from Turing. But there was a school all along who was trying to work on the non-von Neumann architecture, who depended on Alonzo Church's approach, and who said that if we have to overcome the computability problem, then we have to take not Turing's approach, but Alonzo Church's approach. But that is a long story, a different story. I won't like to harp on it anymore further. But since you are interested and if you have raised this question, I would request you to study a little bit more on Alonzo Church's work and non-von Neumann architecture. Okay, they actually tried to deal on this computability problem from a different angle.
Thank you so very much, sir. Even I agree with this statement that computability one fine day will reach to the, or is gradually reaching to the saturation, in the sense because every aspect of the computation cannot be analyzed through the computation.
Right.
Yes. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your thought-provoking talk. So, sir, it was a great experience to hear from you. And thank you for your time, sir, out of your busy schedule.
Thank you, everybody, for patiently listening also.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Fast talk, actually. I would have loved to talk more slowly, but since time is limited. Okay, yeah.
Yes, sir. It was really a blessing for us.
Okay.
And opportunity to hear from you, sir.
Thank you. So,
thank you, sir. Thank you from the entire team, sir.